Okay, before we get started with the video proper, I want to tell you guys that I am working with a company called Trip to possibly organize a kind of vacation for you subscribers and me to visit somewhere in the world and learn about the culture and history together. If something like this sounds like it would be of interest to you, then check the description and find the link for a survey. Now, this is just a survey measuring the levels of interest that the audience has. There is no commitment to travel or buy anything at this time. This is just seeing how many people might be interested in taking a trip with me somewhere overseas. That where will be determined by, well, what the survey says. So, with that out of the way, let's get on with the regular video.
Screw this, I just came over to buy some fireworks.
There are 3 things you're not allowed to talk about in China. Taiwan being an independent country, why this guy looks like Winnie the Pooh, and the You may have seen a clip of this guy standing in front of a tank. This clip is from the Tiananmen Square Massacre, but it's not the full story, so what exactly is the backstory to this event, and why did the Chinese government respond this way? To understand this, we need to go back over 20 years before this clip. In the mid-1960s, Mao Zedong had been voluntarily out of power for a few years, but he didn't like the direction China was going. He felt the principles of the revolution were slipping away, and that the people were being infected by bourgeois liberalism, so he decided to incite a populist backlash against it. This became known as the Cultural Revolution. The foot soldiers of the Cultural Revolution were university students. They organized into paramilitary groups calling themselves the Red Guards. They would harass, both verbally and violently, the local government and party officials, claiming they were insufficiently revolutionary, and in some cases accusing them of treason. Students spied and reported on their families, friends, professors, and classmates who were either killed or sent to re-education camps, the Laogai. And just a quick footnote, if you ever watched Avatar: The Last Airbender, this is where the Dai Li agents of Ba Sing Se got the name of their secret headquarters. The Cultural Revolution is a subject worthy of its own video, but suffice it to say that it was a reign of terror in which Mao and his inner circle empowered themselves. It was a massive disruption to the social structures of China, which it has not yet fully recovered from. Most people in China know somebody who was impacted by it. Even the father of the current president of China, Xi Jinping, was denounced in the Cultural Revolution. This was a traumatic period that only came to an end after Mao's death in 1976, after which his wife and inner circle, the Gang of Four, were arrested. Coming to power after Mao was Deng Xiaoping, and he would begin the process of opening China up to the rest of the world, and reforming it into a market-based economy. The outside world looked at this and thought it was a promising first step. The idea was that if China became more capitalist, then they would become more wealthy overall and therefore raise everyone's standards of living. The wealthiest of Chinese, especially those left out of the structures of power, would begin demanding a greater say in the affairs of governance. The demand and pressure from this group would become so great that the regime would be forced to either reform and democratize, or to succumb to revolution and, hopefully, be replaced by a more democratic system. This was based on an understanding of the West's own path towards democracy, which went hand in hand with increased wealth. So when Deng opened up China to foreign investment and market forces, the Western world was optimistic. Deng began proposing reforms in 1980, criticizing bureaucracy and the centralization of power, advocating term limits for leadership positions, while also advocating democratic centralism and collective leadership. To bring about the desired reforms, Deng would appoint Zhao Ziyang as premier and Hu Yaobang as the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. The 2 biggest factors of a market-based economy are privately owned means of production and free-floating prices for goods and services based on the supply and demand for them. Now, even to this day, the Chinese economy isn't fully private. The state reserves the right to confiscate the property of individuals and corporations for whatever reason it sees fit, and there is a tendency for people in positions of authority to wield this power against political or business rivals. But it has been decentralized enough for Western companies to feel comfortable investing in China. In 1981, about 73% of farms had been decollectivized. They wanted to move toward a more market-driven price system, but they were much slower in deregulating prices than production. The state, as part of its cradle-to-grave welfare system, colloquially known as the Iron Rice Bowl, strictly regulated the prices of necessities, especially food. They tried to deregulate prices gradually, giving people advance notice of when a certain good was going to be deregulated. Now, at first glance, this seems like a good idea. Giving people advance notice of a major change in regulation, in Western countries at least, gives people and corporations a chance to adjust so they aren't caught off guard. But in this circumstance, the forewarning actually caused problems. The economic planners in Beijing would decide that a certain good should have its prices deregulated, and they would make an announcement about this a certain amount of time in advance. This was a clear market signal telling people that if you buy this good after this date, you will have to pay more. But if you buy it before this date, you get to pay less. This process incentivized people to buy up more of a good than they needed, such as rice and other foodstuffs, and hoard it until the price was deregulated, at which point they could turn around and sell it at a higher deregulated price. This would cause a shortage of the deregulated goods around the country, and in some cases causing mini famines. The regime would have been better off had they just announced that all prices would be deregulated at the same time and done so without warning. China's economy was a stack of bad ideas about to fall over. Communism was bad enough. On top of this, they added price controls, which never works for long, and then you had this piecemeal deregulation that incentivized hoarding. This was bad enough. But on top of all of that, you have the rampant corruption that is seen in most authoritarian regimes. You see, in the late 1970s and 80s, China was still a very poor country. You didn't have these conspicuous Chinese billionaires hiding their wealth overseas like today. So, who would have had enough excess capital to make buying out and hoarding food a viable investment opportunity? Regime insiders. Those who worked in the government, the military, or the Chinese Communist Party. Not only did regime insiders have access to more capital than those outside the regime, they also had access to insider information. And although it's not quite insider information, you can get better insight into the information you consume with ground news. With the 34th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre happening recently, we've seen a slew of new articles reporting on the Chinese government suppressing access to the real-world site. And there is a pretty good spread of news outlets from the political left to the right covering the story, which is one of the great features that ground news offers. When you're looking at a story, they list all the articles that have been published about it, and they have a handy graph showing the bias of the various outlets reporting it. Ground news also lets you compare the headlines of the various articles reporting the story, so you can see whether or not they are leading with sensationalism or mootness. Of particular interest in our modern news and political environment is the blind spot page, which brings you stories that are either being underreported or overreported from sources that are politically affiliated with one side or the other. What stories are the right talking about that the left isn't, and vice versa. For some time now, I have intentionally tried to limit my intake of news feeds, largely because a lot of it just ends up being nonsense that doesn't really count as news. But thanks to ground news, I've been able to increase my consumption of news because it lets me filter out the nonsense and see my own blind spots. And it's been extremely helpful when guiding, say, the process of making videos, talking with friends or family, even contemplating future poll booth decisions. Try it out through my link for 30% off unlimited access and get it for as little as $5 a month to support their mission as well as this channel. Thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring this video. But for now, let's get back to the history and looking at the corruption in the Chinese government. They knew about the upcoming price deregulations before they were officially announced, which meant that they had the opportunity to buy out these goods before outsiders even knew this was a good idea. This is the same kind of corruption that would spoil the privatization efforts in Russia in the 1990s. The party had two factions. The reformers, led by Hu Yaobang, advocated greater political liberalization, while the conservatives, led by Cheng, believed the market reforms had gone too far and the state needed to rein in the economy. In 1986, a Chinese astrophysics professor teaching at Princeton, Feng Lizi, returned to China and began touring universities, speaking about American ideas of liberty, human rights, and the separation of powers. Party leadership would decry Feng as being blinded by Western influences. Protests began at universities in Hefei and spread to other major cities. The CCP accused Feng and the students' movement of orchestrating another cultural revolution. Hu Yaobang was forced to resign as general secretary in January of 1987. This was the beginning of the anti-bourgeois liberalization campaign. In 1987, the CCP Congress had a speech given by Zhao Ziyang, titled "Advance Along the Road of Socialism with Chinese Characteristics." After that speech, Zhao would be elected the general secretary of the party. Hu Yaobang would die of an unexpected heart attack on April 15, 1989, and many students believed that the state or the party had something to do with it. Protests would begin as eulogies and mournings for Hu, but days later you began to see posters advocating for political reforms. They began on April 15th at the Monument to the People's Heroes at Tiananmen Square. That same day, protests at Peking and Tsinghua universities began as well. On the 16th, students began gathering at Xi'an and Shanghai, and on the 17th, they expanded to the China University of Political Science and Law. A crowd of CUPL students made their way to Tiananmen Square at 5 p.m. on the 17th, reaching the eastern gate of the Great Hall of the People. The police would non-violently disperse the crowd. On April 17th, 3,000 PKU students began marching toward Tiananmen Square at night, with 1,000 students from Tsinghua joining them. At Tiananmen Square, they began to draft lists of demands from the government. Affirm Hu Yaobang's view of democracy and freedom, end the campaigns against spiritual pollution and bourgeois liberalization, publish the financial information of state leaders and family members, freedom of the press, increase funding for education, freedom of speech, and provide objective coverage of students in official media. Gatherings around Tiananmen continued to grow on April 18th. Another group gathered at the Xinhua Gate near the CCP headquarters and demanded a meeting with the party leadership. The police would restrain the students from entering the building, at which point the students staged a sit-in. By April 20th, most of the students had left, with the 200 remaining being roughed up by the police. But news of this caused the protests to reignite and grow, with more university students joining in. Hu's funeral was held on April 22nd, with large crowds gathered in Tiananmen Square against government orders. Student leaders demanded a meeting with the premier, Li Peng, who refused to see them. Rioting broke out in Changsha and Xi'an, resulting in looting and arson. On April 23rd, the students formed the Beijing Students' Autonomous Federation, more commonly called the Union. They elected Zhao Yongjun to be their chair. Other leaders emerged, and they called for all the students of Beijing universities to boycott their classes. General Secretary Zhao Ziyang left for a meeting in North Korea on April 23rd, leaving Premier Li Peng in charge. The Beijing Party Secretary, Li Zhiming, along with Mayor Cheng wanted to resolve the protests quickly, framing them as part of a conspiracy to overthrow the party. On April 25th, Deng Xiaoping approved the hardline stance against the protesters. On April 26th, the People's Daily issued a front-page warning to the students titled, "It is necessary to take a clear-cut stand against disturbances." It branded the protests as anti-party, anti-government, and as the vanguard of a second cultural revolution. Protests grew larger on April 27th, with students from all Beijing universities participating, marching on Tiananmen Square. In response to the People's Daily, the student leaders made sure to tone down the anti-communist rhetoric in order to appear more patriotic. They branded their protests as being against corruption. The premier would meet with representatives of government-sanctioned student groups, but not the protesters. Zhao Ziyang returned to Beijing and thought Li Peng and the party leadership had screwed up big, unnecessarily antagonizing the students. He changed the government's tax by allowing the press to cover the movement in a positive light, so long as they focused on the anti-corruption slogans. This seemed to calm down the protests, because on May 4th, all Beijing universities except for PKU and BNU announced an end of the student boycotts, which drove down student involvement. The union had become fractious. More moderate leaders accepted the government's change in tone as sufficient, while others wanted the protest to regain momentum. They didn't trust the government's offer of a dialogue and instead called for a return to confrontational tactics, and so on May 13th, they began a hunger strike. The strike was deliberately planned to occur right before a visit from Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev. Since the 1960s, relations between the USSR and China had been cold, each denouncing each other as counter-revolutionary or heterodox. But when Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he began a campaign to try and normalize relations with the PRC. In 1988, Deng Xiaoping invited Gorbachev to Beijing for a Sino-Soviet summit, and the protests in Tiananmen Square threatened to either derail the summit altogether or to weaken the Chinese government by showing disunity to a foreign power. On May 13th, 300,000 people had gathered in Tiananmen Square, and they had widespread public sympathy. This would reignite strikes and protests at other universities, and while marching to the square, the students would sing the Communist Internationale in order to portray themselves as being loyal to the party. But Deng ordered the square be cleared before Gorbachev's visit, while Zhao tried to negotiate with them to encourage them to leave. On the morning of May 13th, the head of the CCP's United Front, Yan Mingfu, called an emergency meeting with student leaders and intellectuals. There was supposed to be a welcoming ceremony for Gorbachev at the Tiananmen Square, but uncertain if they could clear the protests up in time, they decided to relocate the event to the runway that Gorbachev was planning to arrive on. This managed to weaken the students' bargaining power. Press restrictions were also loosened in mid-May in order for press outlets to report on the upcoming Sino-Soviet summit, but they were also allowed to report on the protests in ways that were positive. Student leaders would meet with the government, but they were all divided over their ultimate goals and aspirations, and when the students learned that the meeting that they were told would be nationally televised wasn't actually televised, they walked out of the meeting and everything kind of fell apart. The protests continued through the summit with Gorbachev. On 14th May 1989, we flew into the Chinese capital. There was a mood of excitement and concentration all at once. On the approach, we were informed by radio telephone that the official welcoming ceremony would take place immediately at the airport. 10 days earlier, Tiananmen Square had been occupied by students. Zhao had told Gorbachev that Deng was still the real power in China, which was picked up by the media at the time, and was seen as him trying to shift the blame to Deng, despite him having told President Bush the same back in February 1989. When the topic of the protest came up, Zhao said to Gorbachev, "Naturally, the students have a naive and simplistic view of many things. They think all they have to do is put out a slogan and the party and government will solve all their problems in a single day." To which Gorbachev replied, "We are running into the same general problems. We have our hotheads too." They talked about whether you can create an uncorrupt democracy in a one-party system. Jiang said he wanted to experiment with democracy within the one-party system, allowing open democracy within the party and only considering a multi-party system if one-party democracy failed. The Soviet Union had decided to implement political reforms first, while China decided to implement economic reforms first. It has evoked special interest among the intelligentsia, which has demanded that China learn from you and emulate your experience. In his notes, Gorbachev notes his sympathies for the Chinese regime and the changes they were trying to oversee. Only later did it become clear to me what this man was going through, what an internal struggle between assumptions and values. Now here he was, faced with a democratic challenge from the student masses. Many were demanding the imposition of order, since the student demonstrations had taken on the character of civil disobedience. But most of these demonstrators were people who had followed him, after all, or at least who had been inspired by ideas he himself shared. Herein lay his drama. Protests spread across Beijing with nearly 1 million marching in solidarity between May 17th and 18th, which included PLA officers, police officers, and lower party bosses. Youth league organizations and government-sponsored labor unions encouraged their members to demonstrate as well. The Chinese Red Cross sent in personnel to provide medical services to the hunger strikers, and foreign journalists remained in the country after Gorbachev left to report on the protests, which is how we got all of this footage today. Students from across the country poured into Beijing, and similar protests erupted across 400 Chinese cities. Local officials didn't know how to respond without an official position from the CCP in Beijing. A Politburo meeting on May 17th saw Zhao's conciliatory approach criticized. Deng would say, "There is no way to back down now without the situation spiraling out of control. The decision is to move troops into Beijing to declare martial law." The protesters were, again, decried as bourgeois liberalism. Zhao Ziyang and Hu Quil had opposed the crackdown, while Li Peng, Yao Yilin, and Deng supported it. Zhao refused to take part in the enforcement and would go on leave, leaving the vice chairman of the Central Military Commission to mobilize troops. Li Peng met with the students on May 18th in order to placate public opinion. The students again demanded the April 26th editorial be rescinded, and that they be described as patriotic in the press. On May 19th, Zhao Jiang went to Tiananmen Square, accompanied by Wen Jiabao. He encouraged them to end the hunger strike and go home. Students, we came too late. We are sorry. You talk about us, criticize us. It is all necessary. The reason that I came here is not to ask you to forgive us. All I want to say is that students are getting very weak. It is the 7th day since you went on a hunger strike. You can't continue like this. You are still young. There are still many days yet to come. You must live healthily and see the day when China accomplishes the 4 modernizations. You are not like us. We are already old. It doesn't matter to us anymore. On May 19th, the PSC met with the party and military leaders. Deng said martial law was the only option and decided to remove Zhao as general secretary. Martial law was officially declared on May 20th. 14 PLA corps were used and 250,000 soldiers were sent to the capital. Guangzhou province shut down all civil air and rail traffic to accommodate the movement of troops. The protesters blocked soldiers' entry into the capital around the suburbs of Beijing, forcing the army to withdraw on May 24th. This led many to believe that the tide was turning in the students' favor, but across the country, soldiers were being mobilized. The students were disorganized, and all attempts to try and elect a leader of their movement to negotiate with the government fell apart because of the interests of other groups. The square was growing overcrowded, and sanitation issues began to emerge. Some student leaders, anticipating a military crackdown, began to moderate their positions and demands. Fights broke out over control of the loudspeakers, which were seen as defining who the leader of the movement was. Various factions began to accuse each other of secretly working with the government. On June 1st, Li Peng issued a report on the true nature of the turmoil. It labeled the protesters as terrorists and counter-revolutionaries, and argued the legality of clearing Tiananmen Square by force. Other reports emphasized the students as agents of bourgeois liberalism, under the control or influence of the United States and the West. On June 2nd, newspapers began publishing articles calling for the protests to disperse, which sparked wider protests. Some activists tried to regain momentum by declaring another hunger strike. That evening, reports of an army trencher running over and killing 4 civilians spread and sparked fear that the military crackdown was imminent. Student leaders issued orders to set up emergency roadblocks to stop the movement of troops. On June 3rd, police began to use tear gas to disperse protesters. Unarmed police emerged from the Great Hall, which the protesters responded by throwing stones. At 4:30 p.m., party, military, and government leadership met to finalize the order of martial law. The directive did not explicitly give a shoot-to-kill order, but it did say, use any means. On the evening of June 3rd, state-run television began airing warnings for residents to stay home. PLA units had surrounded Beijing. The army began to fire into the air as they entered the city, hoping to scare the crowds off. But it failed. When crowds blocked their path down a road, the soldiers would fire into civilians, using expanding bullets, which were prohibited by international law for use in warfare. On June 5th, the most famous scene from the massacre occurred. The tank man standing up to the PLA tank. At one point, he climbed on top of the tank and tried speaking to the soldiers inside it. The man was pulled out of the way of the tanks, and to this day, nobody is exactly sure what happened to him. The Chinese government suppresses the story, but initially they said the incident had 300 casualties. At the time, the Chinese Red Cross said the figure was closer to 2,600. The Swiss ambassador said 2,700. New York Times journalist Nicholas D. Kristof said on June 21st that it was somewhere between 400 and 800. U.S. Ambassador James Lilly said it was at minimum several hundred. Beijing hospitals reported between 480 and 920. Amnesty International estimates between several hundred and 1,000. A disputed cable from British Ambassador Alan Donald initially claimed at least 10,000 dead, which were repeated by Australian Prime Minister Bob Hawke. Alan Donald later revised his estimate to between 2,700 and 3,400. The Western world responded with rhetorical outrage, but not much change in terms of actual policy towards China. I wanted a measured response, one aimed at those who had pushed for and implemented the use of force, the hardliners and the army. I didn't want to punish Chinese people for the acts of their government. I believe that the commercial contracts between our countries had helped lead to the quest for more freedom. If people have commercial incentives, whether it's in China or in other totalitarian systems, the move to democracy becomes inexorable. For this reason, I wanted to avoid cutting off the entire commercial relationship. The United Kingdom was in a special bind. Not too long ago, they had finished negotiating their handover of Hong Kong back to China after its 99-year lease ended in 1997. The crackdown in Tiananmen Square created fear in Hong Kong, which resulted in the British needing to respond. The Chinese belief that the benefits of a liberal economic system can be had without a liberal political system seems to me false in the long term. The crackdown after the Tiananmen Square massacre in June 1989 convinced many outside observers that in China, political and economic liberty were not interdependent. Certainly, after those terrible events, we reassessed what needed to be done to secure Hong Kong's future. In 1990, the British government gave British citizenship to 50,000 key people in Hong Kong, along with their dependents. To this day, the Tiananmen Square massacre is covered up in China, and if the event is referred to at all, it's referred to as the June 4th incident, and even that is becoming rarer and rarer. And as China cracks down on Hong Kong, Tibet, the Muslims of Western China, along with the rest of its people and COVID lockdowns, the desire to talk about the event grows stronger. Thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring this video. If you want to filter out the news yourself and support this channel, then check out ground.news/casualhistorian. Top link in the description. I'd also like to thank my patrons for helping make this video possible. In particular, I'd like to thank the patrons that joined last month: Daniel, Jesse, Max, and Vilius. Supporting the Patreon gives you access to special perks such as getting to see videos early and getting access to a patrons-only Discord server. Also, if you're interested in possibly traveling with me somewhere in the world and learning about the history and culture of some location, then go down into the description and take the survey from Trova Trip. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.